Hey everybody! Okay, so today I want to talk about the differences between living in Perth and Sydney. I know it's different to talk about Sydney and London, but I thought it might be useful to some of you. So anyway, yeah, so obviously Perth and Sydney, very different places to live. One is on the east coast of Australia, one is on the west coast of Australia. Apologies also for my damp hair still. it hasn't dried properly yet. I don't dry my hair, I tend to just leave it, so it's the morning here, it still hasn't dried yet. Anyway, so the differences between Perth and Sydney. So I'm going to start off by talking about the beaches, because to me that is the most important difference between the two, which sounds a little bit crazy because they both have beaches. It's Australia, the beaches are amazing everywhere in Australia, but they're very, very different. Okay, so personally, I think that Perth has better beaches. They're a lot quieter. You literally go to a beach in Perth and there's like no one there. There might be maybe a couple of other people, but generally they're pretty empty. In Sydney, you go to Bondi or Bronte or Coogee or any beach here and it's literally packed with people. I'm talking about, you know, in England, so I'm trying to think of an example. So if you go to like Bournemouth Beach on a sunny day in England in the summer and it's like wall-to-wall people, that's what the Sydney beach is like. It really shocked me when I moved to Sydney and I went to Bondi Beach and there was just this wall of people. I was like, oh my gosh. So then I went to some other beaches like Bronte and Coogee to see if that was any different. They're all like that, and Manly too, and even Shelley Beach. Shelley Beach is like this small little beach that a lot of tourists don't tend to go to. Even that, all the beaches here, wall-to-wall people like lined up on their beach blankets. Perth, you do not have that issue. Perth, you can choose anywhere on the beach and it will be quiet. And also the Perth beaches, the sand is a lot whiter, it's a lot softer. The beaches tend to be bigger, I think. I guess because Perth is basically just one long beach all up down the coast, whereas Sydney is very broken up. Sydney, the coastal area is a lot more Mediterranean, very kind of rocky, hilly cliffs, whereas Perth is just flat beaches. I guess the place that most reminds me of Perth beaches is Florida. So if you've been to Florida, the Perth beaches are like Florida beaches. You've got that pure white soft sand and then this stunning clear pale blue water in front of you. Whereas Sydney is definitely more Mediterranean with kind of green blue ocean and then more golden sands. But anyway, I prefer Perth beaches. Some people might not agree with me or might think that Sydney ones are nicer, but it just depends what kind of beaches you like, I guess, whether you're more of a Mediterranean-y, rocky, mountainous scenery person or more of a Florida Caribbean-y type of person. So yeah, anyway. The second thing I'm going to talk about is housing. So Perth's houses are literally half the price of Sydney. Whether you're buying or renting, they're half the price. If you want like not even a one bedroom, if you want like a studio apartment or unit in Perth in a really nice area near the beach, so for example Cottesloe or Claremont, you can get one for like $300 a week. In Sydney, like a similar unit, studio, decent size, near the beach, that's going to cost you like $600 to $700 a week. That's double the price, sometimes more than double, and it's literally crazy. And also in Perth, the houses, you still have like terraces and units and apartments, but the houses are a lot more spread out. So in Sydney, obviously, because it's a big city, it's basically the Australian equivalent of London. You've got a lot of terraced houses, the houses are all quite close together. I live in a terraced house with like houses either side of me. This is the first time I've ever lived in a house where I've got houses so close to me because I'm from the countryside in England. And even when I lived in Perth, we lived in a house that was detached. The houses in Perth, you tend to get a lot more like just bigger houses that are spread out, detached. So yeah, that's the housing situation. And then next up, I'm going to talk about the all-important jobs situation. So when I first moved back to Australia from London, I actually went back to Perth first to stay with my auntie and uncle, see my friends, hang out there for a few weeks while I sorted myself out, and found a job in Sydney. So in Perth, the main reason that I came to Sydney was because there are no jobs for me and what I do in Perth. So I work in digital marketing for a media agency, and although we have a Perth office, and I've worked in that Perth office just for like a few days over Easter, it's the opportunities in Perth for my industry in particular aren't particularly good. Perth is very much a mining city. A lot of the big oil and gas companies have their head offices in Perth. A lot of the jobs are all to do with the mining industry and like the fly in fly out FIFO industry, and also obviously there are loads of hospitality jobs there because there are so many restaurants and bars and stuff, whereas in Sydney the job opportunities are just a lot better, especially for what I do. So if you're in media at all, Sydney is the place to go, and then obviously because it's Sydney, it's like the main city. It's not the capital is Canberra, but it's like the unofficial capital of Sydney, of Australia. So you get a lot of Australian head offices in Sydney. So yeah, there's just a lot more job opportunities in Sydney if you're not in the mining industry or the hospitality industry. Okay, and then so moving on to kind of the more fun stuff away from the housing, jobs, boring shit. Restaurants wise, I actually, similar to the beaches, I think Perth has better restaurants, and this is a controversial one because Sydney-siders are very passionate about their food and their restaurants and are very supportive of their restaurants, but coming from London and then moving, obviously having lived in Perth in the past when I was younger and going back to Perth for 6 weeks and then coming to Sydney and living in Sydney for the past year, I do think that Perth restaurants are better. Please, no one in Sydney hate me. But just from my personal opinion, I think that the Perth restaurants, the food is a much higher quality. It's a lot fresher. The seafood and the meat and the fruit and veg is a lot fresher. I just prefer the restaurants over there. It's just obviously because it's smaller, you've got like less variety and less choice. Even though there is still loads of choice in Perth, there are like thousands of restaurants and cafes there. But I just think Sydney has so many restaurants and cafes, a lot of them aren't that great. And because there is so much competition here, people, like the prices in Sydney are really expensive for what you get. Whereas in Perth, I don't know, I just feel like the Perth restaurants are way better, and I much prefer eating out in Perth than to Sydney, and I find Perth restaurants a lot cheaper, but the thing is you get better quality food in Perth restaurants for a cheaper price than you do in Sydney. So yeah, that's, sorry Sydney, soz. And then also, but bars and nightlife, Sydney is obviously far better. If anyone has ever been to Perth, you will know I don't know what word to describe it. The dullness, the dull nightlife in Perth. Dull and dodgy, that is how I would describe Perth nightlife. Very dull, very dodgy. Not a lot there. They have gotten better. Like when I was 16 and I had a fake ID, my friends and I would use our fake IDs and go to like some of the clubs and stuff in Freo. At the time we thought they were amazing because we did not know any different, and those were the only clubs that we had ever been to. But obviously now, having gone to nightclubs around the world and having lived in London for 5 years while I was a student and then working there, not 5 years, 8 years, that's scary. Okay, I feel old. Excuse me. Anyway, The Perth nightclubs are shit. The bars have gotten better. So when I left Perth when I was 17 to move back to London. I used to go back every year to visit my friends and my now ex-boyfriend who still lived there. And I've seen it slowly change over the years, and slowly they have gotten better bars and a lot more bars. It's very much a kind of hipstery scene there. It's similar to Newtown in Sydney and like Shoreditch in London, where the bars are very hipstery, unique. Each of them has their own little quirky personality. They are a lot of fun, but not many people go to them. They're always quite empty, and they stop serving shots. And what else? No shots. I think it's just no shots at midnight, which, I mean, they do that all over Australia, in Sydney too, but it's just stupid. Why would you stop serving shots after midnight? And they also close really early. And the nightclubs in Perth, there aren't many nightclubs, but the ones that are there are dodgy. Very, very dodgy. So yeah, but Sydney has great nightclubs, great bars. Obviously the nightclubs here aren't really on par with London and New York or Dubai or any of the other major cities, mainly because it's just not really the culture here. The culture in Sydney and Australia in general is very much, you go to a bar and that bar will then turn into kind of a clubby type of thing later in the evening. So we'll like have a dance floor and everyone will just go to this bar for like dinner, and then it will move on to drinks, and then the dance floor and DJ will be there and you just stay there. Sydney has lockout laws, so all of the clubs tend to close about 2 AM. There are very few that are open later than that, and they tend to be the gay clubs. But yeah, Sydney has better nightlife. So Sydney, I'll give you that. Okay, so when it comes to like the layout and the style of each city, Perth is very spread out. So Sydney is like your typical city, major city. It's a city style, there's a CBD, there are kind of suburbs around it. But even the suburbs around it, even the suburbs further out, don't have a lot of space. So obviously you've got, like I said earlier, you've got terraced houses, a lot of apartments, not many big homes. Perth is the complete opposite. You've literally got 3 main roads in the CBD in Perth, and then that's it, that's the city. The rest of Perth is suburbs, and you really have to have a car in Perth. It's very difficult to get around on public transport, just because everything's so spread out. And I mean, when I was living there, I lived in a place called City Beach, and then my friends lived in like Mosman Park, Claremont, Dalkeith, Swanbourne, and you had to drive to those places because there was no train line in City Beach. There's only really like a train line through the main river route, so like the suburbs that go along the river, and then you've got the train line up to Joondalup and the train line south, but all the suburbs in between those have no train line, and the buses are shit. The buses are very infrequent, and yeah, you have to have a car in Perth. But I actually really love driving, and I love having a car and having that freedom to drive. So for me, I love the layout of Perth because I love how spacious everything is, how spread out it all is, how you can just get in a car, drive up the coast road, and yeah, I love going back to Perth just to get in a car and just drive on these big empty roads where there are hardly any cars. And yeah, I love the layout of Perth. I love Perth. Perth is always, I'm so biased towards Perth because it's always been my second home. I've gone there most years since I was 7. I lived there for 2 years. So I am very biased. I'm sorry if I'm like favouring Perth massively in this video. But anyway, the good thing about Sydney as a city is it is a city, it's a proper city. Perth does not feel like a city at all. Sydney, for me, Sydney is the perfect in-between of Perth and London. So I was like completely fed up with London. It was too busy, too frantic, too many tourists, but Perth is just too quiet for me to live in now. Like at my age, I feel like it's the perfect place to grow up in, the perfect place to settle down with kids. But in terms of being a young adult, wanting to go out and do things, it's not that exciting. So Sydney is that perfect in between. But the city is a lot more cramped than Perth when comparing the two. Also, in Perth, parking is free pretty much everywhere, apart from the city and Fremantle and the bigger suburbs like Subiaco. Parking is free, like everywhere. You can just park on the side of the road anywhere you want, and it doesn't matter, you're not going to get a ticket. Whereas in Sydney, even on like my road, you have to have a residence permit, or even in the outer suburbs, you have to pay for parking or have a residence permit. In Perth, you don't need that. There's so much space and so little people. You can just park wherever you want. It's amazing. I love it. I miss it so much. Yeah, that's another great thing about Perth. So, in terms of the overall lifestyle, as you can probably gather from this video so far, Perth is the perfect place if you want to be super laid back, super chilled out, very easygoing. Sydney is a city. It's a big city. Well, no, that's a lie. It is not a big city, but it is a bigger city than Perth. It's a proper city, and therefore it has the busyness, it has the franticness, it has a lot of tourists that don't know where they're going, stop at the top of escalators. You know, it has that fast-paced lifestyle. It is a lot. It's still quieter than London. You know, it's like London is on a whole other level, but Sydney is still pretty busy. And also the Perth lifestyle is kind of all about the beaches and the river. As soon as there's any kind of sun, even through the winter, people are on the beaches, people are going swimming, people are going sailing. And although Sydney has a lot of that as well, there's a lot more variety in Sydney, so there's more things to do. You've got more choice of things to do. So because Perth only really has, that sounds bad, because it really only has the beaches and the river and not a lot else there, everybody focuses their lifestyle on the river and the beach. Or if you live out in the middle of nowhere, then it's all about four-wheel driving, like driving through the bush and everything. Up in the hills, Sydney, there's just so much more going on that I've just found that there's less of a focus on going to the beach or going sailing or going out on the water. But don't get me wrong, there is still a massive ocean lifestyle here, and obviously you've got all that outdoor pools as well, so like all of the ocean pools, whereas in Perth you don't have the ocean pools because I don't actually know why. In terms of places to travel to outside of the city, obviously Perth is one of the most isolated cities in the world. It's quicker to get to Bali than Sydney from Perth, but Western Australia is undoubtedly one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to in my life. I've travelled a lot of Western Australia. You've got places like Margaret River, Busselton, Esperance, where you've got the Pink Lake and the kangaroos that go on Lucky Bay. And then up north, you've also got Monkey Mia, Exmouth, Coral Bay, the Kimberley. But Perth is all about road tripping because you don't really get many internal flights within Western Australia. If you do, they're very expensive. So everyone just loves a road trip. You just go on a road trip to all these places. Sydney is obviously a lot easier to get to other places on the East Coast. Every flight within the East Coast is like 2 hours and it only costs like $200, $250 return. But in terms of, also in Perth you have Rottnest Island, which is one of my favourite places in the whole world. I rave about it to absolutely everybody. It's literally this tiny paradise island, a 40-minute ferry ride from Perth, and it's just like nowhere else. It's like the Caribbean, seriously. And it's 40 minutes from Perth. It's like the Caribbean, it's amazing. And you have the quokkas there where you can take a quokka selfie with. But in terms of like flying overseas, Perth, it's only 3 hours to Bali, it's 5 hours to Singapore and Malaysia. And it's also closer to Europe, so it's like 4 to 5 hours closer to Europe than Sydney and the East Coast. Sydney wise, when I moved to Sydney, I was so excited because I thought that it would be super easy and super cheap to go to the South Pacific Islands and New Zealand, and actually it's not. It's like $800 return to get to Fiji or Vanuatu, or even my New Zealand flights cost me $900. I was not impressed. And yeah, and like the flights aren't easy because with the South Pacific Islands you don't have daily flights. You only have like 2 to 3 flights per week to each island, maybe sometimes only once or twice a week, which makes it very difficult to pop over for a weekend or a long weekend, because you can't, because the flights are on like Tuesdays and Thursdays. Like, what the fuck? Even though they're like a 2 to 3 hour flight away. And also loads of them, even though they are only like a 2-hour direct flight away, they only offer indirect flights, and yeah, it's difficult. It's a lot harder than I thought it would be. And even to get to Asia from Sydney, it's like 8 hours to Singapore compared to Perth's 5. And then going home to London, it took me like 30 hours flying or something, instead of 24, 25 from Perth. So yeah, actually, travel-wise, Perth, I found, is easier to get to places. But obviously on the East Coast, you've got more cities and more places within Australia that you can get to very easily. So yeah. Anyway, so those are just my opinions and thoughts on the difference between living in Perth versus Sydney. I hope it's been somewhat useful, even though I feel like I've been super biased. But I mean, I don't know, I just really love Perth. I love Sydney too, but Perth is just so chilled out, so laid back. The beaches are so good, the food is so good. I really miss it. But Sydney is awesome for the bars and the nightlife and things going on and events happening, and just it just suits me in my current life stage right now far better than Perth does. So I hope that helps and it's useful. Let me know in the comments if you agree, disagree with anything, or if you have any requests for any other videos. But yeah, anyway, thanks for watching. Bye!